curtain rises on the second act, with Ian taking centre stage.
For most of my adult life, I didn't believe in ghosts. That is, until a few years ago, when part of my job was to take parties of students around London's theatres, mainly American students. And the story I'm going to tell you is about the Theatre Royal in Haymarket, or as it used to be called many years ago, the Little Theatre in the Hay. On this particular occasion, I had a party of American students, girls, and I had to take them round. We gave them a tour around the theatre itself, sitting in the stalls and talking about the proscenium and so forth. Then we went up on the stage and had a look at that, and half of the party went downstairs to look underneath at the crossover and so forth. But the little party that I had, and I was given the role of bringing up the rear so that no one was lost, was to go up onto the first fly floor, which is an area about 12 to 15 feet above the stage level, where some of the items which are flown into the grid are controlled by ropes. Now, there was a straightforward wrought iron ladder to climb up there, which we did. But there was one lady, a girl really, I suppose. She had on a very large parka, a sort of coat that went all round. Well, there was a metal ring all round this ladder to prevent you falling backwards. You know the sort of thing I mean. Halfway up, she turned to me and she said, "I've got stuck." So I said, "Well, can you get out of the coat you're wearing and drop it over the side, and we'll leave it on the first fly floor and pick it up on the way down?" Which she managed to do. But this lady, who I think we could politely describe as having a full figure, went on ahead of me and climbed up until we came to the second fly floor, where I explained about the ropes that went up to the grid, when she said to me, "Say, mister, do you think we can go up to the grid?" So I said, "Well, if you're feeling brave, yes." So we got out at the second fly floor and started up another wrought iron ladder which took us up to the grid. Now the grid is 67 feet to the stage floor, and I was a little bit concerned, but she seemed full of confidence and she seemed interested, so I thought, why not? So up we went. When we got to the top, there was a large chimney breast in front of us, because of course theatres, when this theatre was built, were all heated by coal fires in the dressing rooms and so forth. So we sat for a moment on a beam and looked out, and I explained about the grid, which is really a rectangle of wood or nowadays metal, in which there are rods crossways with pulleys in them, and all the items which are flown, that is pulled up out of sight of the audience, are controlled by ropes which go over these pulleys and down to the first or second fly floor, and can be pulled up and down as required. Well, we sat there for a minute or two, and then this girl turned to me and she said, "Say, mister," with this lovely American voice she had, "is there a ghost in this theatre?" So I said, "Well, I've never heard that there is, but I expect there is. Most of the theatres do." And at that point, a male voice, unknown to me, which was obviously coming from behind the chimney breast, said, "There's only me here, mister, and you, madam." We both shot up and had a look, and round behind the chimney breast came an elderly man, dressed in working clothes. He had a fairly pale face, but he had quite staring eyes. And I said, "And who are you?" And he said, "Well, I might say the same." So I explained that I was taking parties of students around the theatre. "Oh, good," he said, "there's such a lot to see. I'm just doing a little job round the back of this chimney breast," he said, "and in a moment I'm going to oil the wheels on the grid. It's something I've always done and I like to do it." I said, "Do you mean you're going to crawl and lie flat on the grid and oil them all, the pulleys?" He said, "Yes, that's exactly what I do mean." So I said, "Isn't that rather dangerous?" So he said, "Well, I suppose it is if you don't know what you're doing, but I do. So we sat there for a moment, and then this man appeared with an oil can and stretched himself out flat on the grid, which, by the way, extends over the whole of the stage, and he oiled the pulleys so that they ran well and tested them, and then he crawled back and went back behind the chimney breast. And then after a minute or two, this young lady said to me, "I'd like to go down now." So we said goodbye in a loud voice, and this man's voice said goodbye. And though he seemed a long way away as far as I could tell, way back beyond the chimney breast, and down we came. First the second fly floor, then the first fly floor, where we picked up the lady's parka, and down onto the stage floor. As I said, the grid is 67 feet from the stage floor, and when you look up, it's quite impressive. When you look down, it's quite fearful. So we picked up the rest of our party and continued on with the tour. As I was going down the stairs towards the crossover under the stage manager came up to me and he said, "The rest of your party has gone on. We thought you'd been held up." So I said, "Well, I just took one of the girls up to the grid." "Did you?" he said. "No one is allowed to go up to the grid except the stage staff nowadays, but I won't say anything." So I said, "Why is that?" "Well," he said, "we had a terrible accident." He said, "We had an old chap who used to work here, and even when he retired, he couldn't leave us alone, so he used to come back and oil the grid all the time. And he used to sort of spend his time up there." So I said, "What did he look like?" So he said, "Well, he was about 5'6" high and so forth, weighing about 9 stone, and but he had very strong, piercing eyes. Once you'd seen them, you'd never forget them." So I said, "Oh yes, did he have a pale face?" He said, "It's funny you should say that. He was always known as Smoky on account of his pale complexion." So I said, "Well, I think we've met him already." "You couldn't have done," he said. "He fell to his death from the grid nearly 18 months ago. That's why the management here won't allow anyone to go up there now except the stage staff." So I said, "Oh, that's strange business." And I told him what had happened while we were up there. So he looked at me in a funny way and he said, "I don't think I want to hear any more." So we went on with the rest of our tour. And when we came to say goodbye and to thank the stage staff for the courtesy of having us and all that sort of thing, the stage manager came forward and he said, "Strange things happen in this theatre, you know," he said. "I've been working here for 7 years," he said. "I've never seen any ghosts. But one of you lot comes here today, and I think you've seen what is our ghost." So, of course, everybody was fascinated by this, and they listened to the story again and crowded round this girl, and she said, "My, I feel quite shaky," in that lovely American voice of hers. She turned to me and she said, "I thought you said there were no ghosts here." So I said, "Well, I've never seen one before, but between you and me, I'm beginning to have second thoughts."
I'm here today with someone whose dulcet tones you're bound to recognise, an early member of the Enfield Talking newspaper, Peter Sykes. But we're not here today to talk about talking newspapers. Peter, 3 years ago when we first met, what did you do for a living?
I was one of those evil people, if you like to call it that, who worked in an accounts department of a firm of solicitors, and when the legal work is done, I was one of the team that used to say, "Cough up."
But you had a hobby, a passion even.
I wouldn't say a passion. I had a hobby. I was a member of the Swanage Railway and was a volunteer on their footplate staff, and rose through the heights rose through the ranks, should I say, to the dizzy heights of becoming a driver of steam trains.
So when did you first think that you might be able to make a living out of the railways?
I still wonder that even now.
So when did you first get the urge to try and do something?
I had been working for the firm of solicitors since leaving school, and it was for a period of just over 31 years. So I was in a job where I had been employed by the firm longer than they'd had some of their office furniture. And therefore I thought perhaps the time was to move and change jobs. It was becoming more and more a young person's firm, and an old fogey like me was perhaps a bit past his best or sell-by date, so I thought perhaps I ought to change careers. I did wonder whether or not to stay in the legal profession in the same sort of line, but then I would be constantly referring to the way I used to do things, so I thought, right, let's change career completely. What can I do?
So what did you do?
I applied to a couple of railway companies on the off chance that they may take an old fogey like me, or as I then was, I'm even older now, to become a trainee train driver. They were taking people off the street, and so one of those companies that happened to be local to where I lived, which is West Anglia Great Northern Railway, were clever, or even foolish, whichever way you wish to look at it, to take me on as a trainee driver.
So did the previous experience help at all?
It certainly did. I wish I'd have done it many years earlier, because as one grows older, as many of our listeners will appreciate, the little grey cells tend to hold hands a lot more for comfort, and going back to school, as it turned out to be, and trying to pass exams was a little bit trying, shall we say, on the brain, but even now I managed to get through it. So I think my training on the steam railway side of things did help a lot.
What was the hardest part of the training for you?
Trying to remember everything that they're cramming into you. The rail track rule book for drivers is the biggest rule book that railway publish, because you have to know what everybody else does, signallers, track workers, as well as you as a driver, and therefore it's quite a lengthy tome, and you have to know it to make sure that you can run a safe railway.
So what are you actually doing today?
These days I'm driving the West Anglia Great Northern trains out of King's Cross and Moorgate, the suburban services to Hertford and Welwyn Garden City, as well as the outer suburban services as far as Peterborough and Cambridge.
And have any strange things happened in your travels?
No. Touching wood, and I'm not quite sure whether you can hear that, I'm tapping my head at the moment. I have not really come across any strange occurrences. The worst one, if you're a bird fancier, is the fact that you are always killing birds, I'm afraid, because I suppose it's mainly because they've got small brains. They tend to fly ahead of you, hoping to fly out of the way rather than sideways, and you're invariably going faster than they are. And the most saddest time was when I actually killed a swan, and there's just nothing you can do. You're going at 100 miles an hour, and if it gets in your path, I'm afraid it comes off worse. But that's one of the downsides of the job. But I suppose one might term that an occupational hazard.
Has the Hatfield crash and the impact, the sort of ramifications of that, had any effect on you personally?
No, I tend to be a fatalist, and it's one of those things that if it's going to happen to you, it's going to happen, and I feel there's nothing that you can do about it to influence a situation like that. And I, in fact, went over that piece of track on what we call our Cambridge Cruiser, which is a non-stop service from London to Cambridge and back again, and I was over that very piece of track the day before, and I was doing 100 miles an hour over that very same piece of track. So who knows, that could have been me, but there we go. These things do happen, fortunately very rarely.
So is it somewhat more risky than your former job in that respect, or is it basically safe?
I believe it's inherently as safe as it can be. I probably had more chance of being injured crossing the road at Fleet Street, which is where my office ended up moving to. Fleet Street is quite a busy road, and in the rush hour it's the problems you have with manic courier cyclists and motorbike riders are much more problematical than I think any problems we might have on the railways.
Are you glad you made the change?
I am. I was getting to the stage where we was having to work an awful lot of overtime, and I was getting more than a little ratty at times. And this job has its moments, but I feel happier in myself, and one or two other people have commented that I seem to be a lot happier. So I genuinely do think I did take the right choice, and looking back, I wish I'd have taken it a few years earlier.
Is there anything you do miss from your old job?
Yes. The simple things in life, such as being able to get a drink more or less when you want to, whereas on the trains you have to plan it in advance. And the other minor technicality is, not to put too fine a point on it, going to the loo. Working in an office, you could just, if necessary, put your pen down or stop typing on the computer and wander along, whereas a little bit of advanced planning is required when driving a train.
Too different between stations.
Yeah.
Do you still go and do the Swanage Railway at the weekend?
I do indeed, yes. I still drive steam trains as well as their diesel fleet down there as well. And it's quite different, much more sedate. And with the problems after Hatfield of all the track speed restrictions, we're actually going faster down on the Swanage Railway, where we can do up to 25 miles an hour, than we can do on some of the main line even now, these many weeks. And we're recording this at the beginning of March. And the accident happened at Hatfield in October, and there's still sections where we can still only do 20 miles an hour. And it's quite frustrating, both for me as a driver and I'm sure for my passengers.
Well, Peter, thank you very much indeed for not only recording your own interview, which makes you an excellent interviewee from my perspective, but also for sparing the time to tell us about your dramatic change in direction. Long may you continue to enjoy your new career.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith, and my kindest regards to all of our listeners, and hope you enjoy the magazine tape as much as we have enjoyment in making it for you.
Recently, we've heard a lot about railways and education. You've just heard Peter on the rails. Now here's an insight into education.
This is an item by Graham Darling about how the church lost its control over education. One of the most fiercely contested elections held in Enfield was the school board elections of 1894. They were important to every community in the days before state education, because the school board decided the future of education for children in the area. In 1870, a Liberal government passed the Education Act, which allowed school boards to be created in any area where not enough was thought to be done by voluntary schools. Enfield needed more schools. The population had risen from 16,054 in 1871 to 31,536 in 1891, nearly a doubling in size in 20 years. The majority of newcomers to the borough were of childbearing age, and so the need for more schools in Enfield was becoming acute. But in those days, religious matters were a strong issue. The Church of England wanted control of education, and it feared the Act would create schools for nonconformists. So when the school board was created in 1894, it saw a battle between Anglican stalwart the Reverend George Hodson and his feared Liberal and nonconformist enemies. There were 14 candidates fighting over 9 seats. The result did not please Mr. Hodson. His church party took 3 seats, and the Progressives, a party for the liberal-minded, won 3, with the Independent winning the other 3. The Independents were men with liberal sympathies. They toppled the influence of Mr. Hodson and elected George Spicer to serve as chairman in 1897, and there he remained until the boards were disbanded by another act in 1903. Mr. Spicer was a rich paper manufacturer who lived in a huge house on the Ridgeway. He was a Congregationalist and a strong radical liberal. He was also a friend of another top Enfield public servant, John James Ridge, the Officer of Health. Under Mr. Spicer, the board took over the running of 3 existing schools. It then opened Chesterfield Road School, serving Enfield Lock, and Alma Road School in Ponders End. In 1901, Chaseside School was also opened. The school board election and the battle between Hodson and Spicer had important results, which last up until today.
And finally,
We are now in the home of Alan Johnson, who is the chairman of Cheshunt Natural History Society, and we're going to talk about animals and birds in and around the London borough of Enfield. Now, Alan, may I ask you first of all, what first attracted you to this subject of birds and animals?
Well, I suppose it was my ignorance of what they were. One saw all these garden birds, but couldn't put a name to them. And I was an early member of the RSPB when there were about 10,000 of us, as against 1 million of us now. And that's where it all started. And I'm very fortunate because I live on a ridge and I overlook the London basin with farmland below me and woodland behind me. So it's the ideal position to watch birds in.
Do you see any unusual birds?
Yes, there's been a change in the bird population. We hear lots of stories about skylarks disappearing and the house sparrow disappearing. But we forget that newcomers come in. In 1957, the first pair of collared doves bred in the UK in the Norfolk area, and now they're indigenous all over the UK. So we lose some and we gain some. And recently I've seen buzzard, I've seen osprey flying over. Now these are not the kind of birds you would associate. But I also take part in the British Trust for Ornithology Garden Birdwatch, where about 20,000 of us send in a computerised report once a month of the birds we see in our garden, and it's quite interesting to see the demise of some species. The song thrush I have started hearing again, but I don't see. The blackbird has dropped off the list. I saw one this morning, but they're not terribly common, and the house sparrow.
Is the dropping off in these particular species that you mentioned due to the absence of suitable food for them?
Well, I think the main problem is farmers never let fields lie fallow anymore. The pressure on farmers to produce cheap food is so enormous that as soon as the crop is taken off, they plough the field, so there's no grain lying on a field for 6 weeks until they get round to ploughing it. And there's just no food for seed eaters.
Yes. What about magpies and crows and the bigger birds?
Certainly I've had as many as 30 magpies in the garden at one time.
Have you?
I used to feed them. There was a theory. I read a letter in one of the papers that somebody fed the magpies and crows to avoid them predating the young birds.
Yes.
If they have a full stomach, perhaps they won't predate young birds, but it proved counterproductive. But still, whenever I put odd scraps of food out as against my regular nuts, I'm just inundated with corvids, crows, jays, magpies.
Birds, I suppose, have extra fine sight compared to human beings, to say.
It's quite amazing, certainly with the corvids, the crows, that you put something out and the sky is clear, and within 2 or 3 minutes the first crow appears, and they're very nervous, and they sit there on the oak tree and look, and gradually a whole crew of them arrive and wait for the first one to summon up the courage to go and try some of the food, and soon they're fighting over it.
Sounds like English people at a public meeting. Very nervous at first, but then as soon as they've got their toes in the water, there's a great deal of noise.
But it's curious you mentioned public meeting, thinking politics perhaps, because you do get groups of magpies, and you get they sometimes call it a parliament
Do they?
Same thing happens with rooks.
Ah.
The crows are not quite as
That's
gregarious.
the collective noun, is it, for it? A parliament of crows?
But yes, it has been used.
Ah, that's interesting. Now, what about our four-legged friends, the animal world?
Well, last year, somebody dumped on the ridgeway outside my house a pallet. So I thought, waste not, wants not, and made a home for hedgehog, because hedgehogs suffer from, once again, lack of habitat. Whilst they don't hibernate, they rest for long periods during the winter, and they need somewhere warm and dry. So I made this, and I tucked it away in an odd part of the garden, covered it with a plastic bag and put turf over the top. And lo and behold, I was clearing some of the garden only a week ago, and I've never dared look in this for fear of disturbing them, but outside the entrance to this hide were snail shells, obviously eaten, not smashed as with a thrush, but so I assume I have a resident there, and he's welcome to every snail he can take.
Yes, of course, quite. What about some other mammals, the small ones? Rats and mice we're all familiar with by sight, certainly, and we don't want them in the house, but we certainly see them in the garden from time to time.
Well, unfortunately, I'm a cat lover, and my next cat will be a China one when my current one leaves this mortal coil. But they have been known to bring in mice, which I have to set a humane trap to capture and put them out again. Very interestingly, there was a report of a ginger Tom who brought in a robin, and it was rescued by the householder, who put it in the airing cupboard overnight, and next morning let it out. The Tom captured this robin 14 times.
Good heavens.
And was rested in the airing cupboard and let out again, and as soon as the weather improved, the robin disappeared.
I see.
Perhaps they cooperated.
Well, thank you, Alan, for giving us, I was going to say, a bird's eye glimpse of some of the fauna which is around us, and it may be that our listeners will have the opportunity to discover some of them in due course.
Following on this rather nature-orientated tape, enjoy the rest of the summer and autumn, and we'll be with you again to lighten your winter evenings. This is Tessa, Keith and editor Robin signing off. Don't forget to run this tape to its end and send it back to us in its special postal packet to reach us by 15th of August.